Hello, good evening. Oh, it starts with me. I
You
go
are the one that
first.
starts. You go first.
Oh.
Ladies first, okay?
Good evening, everyone, both on the web and in the spirit realm, and also who are physically here with us. So, Daniel and I just wanted to make a small disclaimer as we go throughout this talk today. We wanted just to make this disclaimer for everyone on the web, for if you're watching the recorded version, the audio version, who are physically here, that we are not psychologists, we are not psychiatrists, we are not therapists. All of what we're going to be discussing here today is based on the codification of Allan Kardec, as well as a slew of excerpts from this book by Dr. Alberto Almeida, who is a psychiatrist. And the book is now in English. It's titled Forgiveness as the Way and the Way to Forgiveness. It's an excellent book to understand the profound nature of forgiveness on many different levels. So we highly recommend this book. We do have it for sale here at the SSB. So it is a shameless plug as well to go and read the book. We also bringing a few excerpts from the Spirits book, of course, the Medium's book, the book Thought and Life that Leo has been doing a series of talks on. It is a book that is, thank you, right here. Some excerpts from this as well, or some of our talks, some of our discussions will be surrounding this as well. A fantastic book also that you should utilize, as well as a book that I removed from there. It's called Hail Christ by the Spirit Emmanuel, psychographed by Chico Xavier, and many other spiritist studies that we went through to kind of get some insight into understanding what forgiveness is. So we just had to make that disclaimer, and also that our talk here today will not attempt to encompass all that which is about forgiveness. This is just sort of a teaser, and in hopes you will go home, apply some of which we're going to be talking about, the practical forgiveness, but also you'll go and read some of these books that we just mentioned and referenced to deepen your understanding of what forgiveness is, because it's so important to understand it, but also to put it into practice. So thank you all for listening to that. Let me go on about that.
So as Kirsten has mentioned, it's not a presentation that's going to be theoretical only, as the title says, practical forgiveness. So I guess everybody is looking for, okay, Daniel, what's the practical forgiveness that you're going to bring, you and Kirsten? And we know that this is very complex subject, because when we talk about forgiveness, we are talking about a situation that happens with all of us, that at some time we can be in a position of victim, we need to forgive, or we are in need to receive forgiveness. So, but before we move to that, the question is on the screen. So we wanted to open and hear from you what is forgiveness for you. And I will handle the microphone. Because we have less than 1 hour, we wanted to cover our topic today. As Kirsten has mentioned, is not something that you're going to leave here with a magic bullet. It's something that is a process, okay? So anyone would like to share your definition of experience of forgiveness?
Well, forgiveness is not, at least, forgetfulness. But I think it's not to hold any bad feelings or revenge against the person that we want to forgive, or they are asked to be forgiven. And needs time.
Anyone? Paula?
Letting go or transformation of feelings of hurt.
That's a good one. So if we're going to do a survey, oh, anyone else, Leo? Sorry.
Forgiveness is a part of the process of rehabilitation by understanding the fault and rehabilitating the other side or ourselves.
Well, the people here is already ahead of, the game. So that's good. So I guess Kirsten and I, we're not going to have much problem to bring this topic here. But it's easy said than done. So, we can define forgiveness as many things. And all this can be from the personal point of view for someone that's going to go through the process, as well for the scholars, people that study the topic of forgiveness. But if Kirsten, but according to this book that Kirsten just mentioned from Dr. Alberto Almeida, he said that forgiveness is a virtue. Virtue, it is one to be attained and acquired with effort. So this definition brings to us what we learn in the Spirit's book, that if it is a virtue, it is something that we need to develop. And in the Spirit's book, we learn that the laws of God is written where? In our conscience. So if we know that the law of God and the divine laws is in our consciousness, what means that we have the seeds of what's right to do it. So, but have the seed doesn't mean that we have the fruit. So we need to work on that. It's a process that goes throughout our evolution. He also says that forgiveness is the ability to give love and compassion in a large quantity. So we give what we have, okay? So to give in a large quantity means that it is something that we have already acquired, that virtue. So when we talk about virtue, we talk about ability, faculty that we develop with time. For example, our intelligence is a virtue, compassion, intolerance. So all these virtues, patience, needs to be acquired. It's not something that we come here to this lifetime and boom, we have. We need to work on that. So by what? We cannot buy, yes. But in the Gospel according to Spiritism, and for those that were here before we start, we are reading the chapter. So there is a whole chapter that called Blessed Are the Merciful, chapter 10 of the Gospel according to Spiritism. And this is one of the Beatitude. So we're not going to go to the detail here because we already read the chapter, but talk about forgiveness according to what we have learned in Christianity. So moving to the next slide, one thing that we need to start, the start point of talking about forgiveness, we need to found the foundation of all what it is to achieve forgiveness. And this is the whole thing, whole shebang, the way we say here in the U.S. It is the foundation of forgiveness is in our relationships.
It's the reason.
It's the reason.
Because
the
without
reason.
relationships,
Exactly.
there would never be a need to forgive
Yes.
anybody.
So in order for us to exercise this feeling, first we need to have some kind of relationship with someone. So we put this diagram just to explain to you. But for example, if you have a relationship with, let's bring family, okay? Let's not our families. So we have a relationship. The relationship in our family is different because it can be husband, wife, husband and father and son, daughter, and the siblings and the other members of the family. At some point, something happens, okay? Something happens. And we put over there as action. I don't know. I was trying to find. It is an experience. You know, there is a relationship that supposedly was stable, and something happened. Now we have two individuals, or more than two individuals, that starts to be in a position that was not part of their relationship. For example, we have someone that is going to be the victim of the situation that felt offended, and there is the perpetrator or the protagonist, someone that was the one that commit the offense. Do you want to jump in, Kiss?
Yeah, I would like to jump in real quick. Just so from a spiritist perspective, we understand and grasp justice. And you can read more about that in the Spirit's book, third part, on the law of justice, love, and charity. So it's important for us to conceptualize that no one is neither 100% victim or 100% perpetrator. So in human eyes, for instance, when you go before a court of law, there's a whole standard or criteria they utilize to develop your sentence, okay? So what they do, they, according to their criteria and according to what you do, they match up how many years you're going to spend in jail or, months or what have you. Divine justice doesn't just look at one life, doesn't just look at the last 2 lives or the last 3. Generally, we're going to throw a number out there. They probably are looking at the last 20 lifetimes in which we played either one of these roles. So that's also just something important in terms of the dynamics of life and the things we experience. We don't like this word very much of victim, but rather we can become victimized. So because no one's 100% a victim or 100% a perpetrator, at some point in our existence, in our evolutionary path, we will find ourselves in this position. Just as a side note, in many of the books of Andrea Louise and the books by Emmanuel, psychographed by Chico Xavier, we can find many cases that can illustrate this point to you. But Daniel, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's a good reminder. One can come to us and says, to whatever situation, but I don't remember my past life. It depends right now here. I feel, that this person has hurt me so badly that now my life has derailed. So we have the tendency, when I say this, is all the humanity, okay? So the tendency to always blame the other side. We are not, what Spiritism brings to us that we are not here, and what I'm saying here is a product of what we have been reading. It's not because I'm a master on this. That we are not here ignoring the feeling, the suffering of the person that was hurt. An example of this is someone, kill someone from your family, okay? Or rob you, or you have, a friend that take advantage of you. I mean, it's not a feeling that you're going to develop, oh, that's okay, I understand. We are not in this level yet. But as Kirsten mentioned, divine law is perfect. But the divine law is written in our conscience. But we are here to what? To exercise those laws and to make those laws become 100% in our life. Living laws, not, get to know, but does not apply when the situation comes. So one thing that we have this relationship, and Kiss is going to go more in detail about what it is not forgiveness and the steps of forgiveness and what kind of movements we need to do in order to achieve the practical forgiveness, because it's a feeling that sometime, as Kiss mentioned, we come in our family or we have a relationship that has been constructed along to many reincarnations, And the divine law is so wise that gives chance after chance through multiple lives for us to come and redress or work that relationship. So reconciliation would be the ultimate goal. Now, when we mention about perpetrator and victim, we have 2 parties here in the business, okay? So if for some reason the victim wanted to forgive, also there is an expectation that the perpetrator also gonna walk half of the way. What happened majority of the time is the victim feel hurted, and in the process of the healing, the process of forgiveness, they can forgive. She or he can forgive, but then the perpetrator is not yet in the level to recognize the act. In the majority of the time, the perpetrator is going to say, I didn't do anything. I didn't say anything. I didn't do this with intention. Is halfway. So the same way that there is something involved these two parties, the two parties need to work together. Well, this can be done in one reincarnation if both sides is willing to work the problem. Now, if there is just one side wanted to make peace, that's fine. You can move on. There is a lot of question on this because many relationships never get resolved in one reincarnation, either because the other party move away or discarnate, and we didn't have chance. Then what's going to happen? Well, Kirsten is going to bring to us some of those steps, and the ultimate goal is reconciliation.
So I wanted to illustrate what Daniel's talking about because it's important for us to understand this factor of reconciliation. It's not a factor that is needed necessarily in the process of forgiveness because of what Daniel just said. Does everybody understand that? So if I have been victimized through trauma, and there's a slew of different traumas that you can think of that can happen to you, that you can experience. So it's not necessary for me to go to the perpetrator and say, I forgive you. Because it's highly likely that when you go to someone that has hurt you or has done something heinous or really bad, it's very likely that if you go to them and say, you know what, Bob, I forgive you, they might say, what do you mean you forgive me? I didn't do anything wrong. And that's just going to make you more angry, and it's going to make your whole forgiveness process more difficult. Forgiveness is a silent movement inside of us. We don't need the other person necessarily. It's ideal if the perpetrator, quote unquote, can realize the error of his or her ways and ask for forgiveness from himself first and then from you and make that movement, because forgiveness is a movement within ourselves first and then outward. But not necessarily does the victim, person being victimized, need for the perpetrator to make that movement so they can move on. Let me illustrate a point. How many people have read the book Hail Christ, psychographed by Chico Xavier by the Spirit Emmanuel? One person in this room. Sarah, can you bring me that book, please? Thank you. One person has read this book? It's been in English for how? A while. Since 2012. It's a phenomenal book. We have about 3 copies. Well, no, this is mine now, so. And I'm added to the list. I have not read it, so don't feel bad. I forgive myself. I free myself from the weight. Thank you. They forgive me. It's also in Portuguese, Ave Cristo. It's an excellent, amazing book. I've just read parts of it. So, yes, the whole collection of Emmanuel, of course, is in Portuguese first. And I think it's even in Russian. Anyway, Hail Christ. So let me tell you guys a story. Okay, this is important. Who likes stories? Oh, okay. 3 of you do. That's okay. I guess the rest of you just bear through it. In this book, Hail Christ, is a story, perfect story of forgiveness. There's an instance where a father is walking with 2 of his children. Let's say there's 2 of them. And soldiers are coming along, and someone recognizes the father and the 2 children as Christian. Now, in this book, they're living in a time where Christians are persecuted and burned and thrown into the amphitheaters, okay? So these soldiers recognize that these people are Christians. And so what happens is that when they try to flee, the 2 soldiers basically send their horses, and the horses kill the children. They stampede over them. I don't know the terminology. They just kind of run them over, if you can imagine, to such an extent where the children become they become sort of, they're they're torn apart into pieces before their father. So imagine the scene, okay? You're a parent. You see your two children just being ran over by horses and literally torn to bits. So the father, what does he do immediately after the horses are taken away and the soldiers are kind of just there? The father gathers up all the parts and pieces of his children, the head, the arm, the leg, everything, puts them all together, kneels, and says a prayer, and says, God, Lord in heaven, please have mercy on this soldier, for he knows not what he does. This father in that instance, in a split second, forgave that soldiers what they did. Will that father and children need to go through many lifetimes and cycle through again and again, as the average person does, most of us do, come back in many reincarnatory plans, having to forgive the soldier? No, he already did. He already surpassed. There was no need for him to even go through this cycle of reconciliation, because in a split second, he already forgave. Now that is the ideal, that you can watch your children murdered before you.
Is a reconciliation with God's law.
Correct.
Is not waiting for the other side. So he understood the situation. He did the prayer. And we are not saying that he didn't suffer the pain.
Right.
We are not talking about the sadness, but he didn't create a revenge immediately inside of him. I just want to try this.
Yes. No, thank you. And as a side note, just because that father forgave the soldiers will not take away the responsibility of those soldiers, that they will have to pay back what they did. Not to the father, because when we transgress a law of God, even though the person might be hurt, but you're transgressing a law of God that we, no matter what, we have to answer for. Does that make sense to everybody? Yes. Okay. There are two types of forgiveness. There is self-forgiveness and something called hetero-forgiveness, which just means it's the forgiveness of others. So these two aspects are very important, and we're going to talk a little bit about this later. But forgiveness is as Dr. Almeida shares in his book, Forgiveness as the Way, and the Way to Forgiveness, that forgiveness is the ability to give love and compassion in large quantity. I want us to stay with that thought and that idea, because that's going to be very important. Love is the way in which it is the way for it allows us to practice this forgiveness. When we started reading and studying about forgiveness and all the ways in which we can do it, we found it kind of annoying in the beginning, that why in this book they focused a lot on self-forgiveness. Why do you think learning and desiring to put forgiveness into practice, we first have to forgive ourselves? Does anyone have any clue off the top of their head why that's so important? So in studying forgiveness, we came across this repeated idea, both in Dr. Almeida's book and throughout the codification, this idea and this need to practice, to learn, to master self-forgiveness. Self-forgiveness. Why is that important?
Well,
Why do you all think, what's your idea?
You just said that the only way for forgiveness, the tool, is love.
Mm-hmm.
So if I have problems with to forgiving myself, of course there is no sufficient, large at least, love. So it's impossible for me to use this love that I don't have to forgive others. So it's an equation.
Perfect. Perfect, Asko. You can come up here and be our third person up here.
Paula.
Well, simply, I can't give to others what I don't have myself. And the other one is, in my mind, pure self-preservation. Because the longer I dwell in a toxic thought, I'm setting myself up for either physical or emotional sickness down the line.
Yes.
Perfect.
Exactly. Perfect. I cannot give what I do not have. In this particular book, in chapter 1, Dr. Almeida actually gives sort of like a more didactic way to explain it. He says it's, for instance, if you are at a level, let's say level 6, okay? That's your maximum level of how much you can give and how much you have for yourself, right? So let's say you're walking along and you have an experience that requires you to have a level 3 or 4 to give love and to give forgiveness. And then you're fine. And you're you know, as they say, you're kosher, you're good, move it along. However, as you further on down that line, when you experience something pretty heavy that requires someone in order to forgive and move on at a level 10, well, you're at a level 6. So in order for you to reach that level to forgive, you need to grow your love for yourself, but also for humanity. And that's something we're going to touch a little bit later. But it's important for us to understand that practicality, that there is sort of like a math in forgiveness.
Yes. Yes, and I just wanted to add this, bring what we learned in the Spirit's book, that is the question that the Noble Spirit answers say, know thyself. I think the whole guideline for us is first is know ourselves. We need to do this inventory in our life and say, okay, if I know that a certain person make me uncomfortable, so why I'm going to expose to that situation? So this is a sign that you already get to know yourself. If you have a potential, if there is a potential to trigger someone or some feeling inside of you that will create more problem, is the level of love which I explained. Exactly. So to define this is mathematically, but sometimes become very difficult because we don't know what is going to happen. And I wanted to add the spiritual component. We always think that it's just us here. But there is also the spirit, the discarnated one, that will take those situations to, make the situation more complicated.
Worse.
So I think it is important, this self-knowledge, also the self-love, and then we can, before we talk about self-forgiveness, we need to know ourselves, we need to love ourselves, and this is something that we don't do overnight. Is a process in our life.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. Yeah, I mean, we cannot gauge. We don't know what our number is, if you will. We don't know if it's 10 or 6 or 4 or 2 unless you spend time getting to know yourself. And sometimes that's just through your experiences and paying attention to how you feel. So if you're walking along and you have this experience and you can gauge like, well, that triggers me, then you know potentially at what level that I'm at. If you're the kind of person that constantly gets irritated and bothered by a lot of things, then it's something we need to think about, reflect on, and see what ways we can develop strengths and virtues within ourselves. But ultimately, going back to what I was saying about the types of forgiveness and self-forgiveness, and this is in the book, our ability to forgive others is directly correlated with our ability to forgive ourselves. So I can't forgive you if I barely can forgive myself because I have no parameters for it. I just don't have the capacity yet, but it can be developed. Just as an FYI, very important for us that we can reach that level 10 or level 20 that you want to get to. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But we wanted to actually touch on what forgiveness is not. Yasko actually kind of mentioned that earlier today because a lot of people have this either fantasy of what forgiveness is, and it becomes so far removed that it almost dehumanizes it, or we just think it's something just not possible at all, and so we don't even bother trying to obtain it. So we kind of wanted to go through a couple of things, what forgiveness is not. I'm going to elaborate. So forgiveness isn't approving the error or wrongdoing. So forgiveness doesn't mean that you're going to say to that person or just other people, because it could be more than one person, no, it's okay. Oh, it's all right. It's important that we acknowledge what has happened. It's very important. We acknowledge our emotions on it. We acknowledge what has happened and the wrongdoing. In the Gospel According to Spiritism, chapter 10, item 21, there's an actual question. It says, are there cases in which it is useful to disclose someone else's evil? This is very important. I want us to pay attention to this because we can experience this throughout our lives. So basically, this question is asking, is it okay to, out somebody? Are there cases in which it is useful to disclose someone else's evil? What do we think the answer is? This is the answer. The spirits give. This question is very delicate. And it is here that one must appeal to charity, rightly understood. If a person's imperfections are harmful to that person alone, it would never be useful to disclose them. However, if they might cause harm to others, it is preferable to take into account the interests of the majority against the interests of only one. Depending on the circumstances, unmasking hypocrisy and falsehood may compromise an obligation because it is better for one person to fall than for several to become his or her victims. In such a case, one must weigh the sum of the advantages and the disadvantages. So basically, for those who know evil was done and that the person can harm others, if we don't alert the masses, we also become guilty by association. So for instance, if you know someone who could be a friend, who you know, no, let me back it up. True case. And this was in the news, there was a HIV positive young man who was going around because he was angry with life, intentionally having homosexual encounters, infecting other people. And we could surmise because he hated life, he hated himself, he wanted everyone else to suffer. Because when we hurt people. Does that make sense? So what happened? He went to jail. This is not a first case. This just happens to be one case that went to the news. There have been other cases in my professional career. We've had patients with AIDS, HIV/AIDS, who have said to healthcare professionals that they have and will continue to infect other people because that they were infected and no one told them and took into consideration. So what happens? We have compassion and we pray for them and we try to console them and get them a good therapist, but we also have to report them. It's very important that we recognize that we don't, it's important that we have compassion and that we have a charitable nature, but it is important that if we know someone can hurt others, that we report them to the authorities. So for instance, there's a case, true case, and there was a book written about it. It's called Let It Go. I don't remember the author's name, but I'll give it to you after the talk, where it was the case of in Salt Lake City in Utah, where a husband, and his pregnant wife and their two kids that were like 8 and 10 sit in the back seat. They had decided one evening to go out for ice cream. And as they're driving to the ice cream place, they enter like this tunnel area, and they see that all they see is the headlights, and they get T-boned. When the father, who was driving at the time, wakes up, he looks over to his wife, and this is a story I heard him tell on the radio, on the Glenn Beck show, where he says, I woke up from this accident and look over, and I can see my wife had a gash on her head. And he said, I had enough medical knowledge to know that that gash was not bleeding. And if she were alive, it should be bleeding profusely. He said, so I immediately checked her pulse. She was dead. I looked back, at my 2 children, and I just knew in my heart they are both dead. Fast forward a few days, just fast forward a little bit. The gentleman who hit them was a 17-year-old drunk driver, and in that moment, the father recounts that as he saw his wife dead, pregnant with their unborn child, and his 2 children in the back, he said in a moment something crossed his mind in the car, that he had a choice to hate the person who he didn't even know in the other car, or to forgive them immediately. He chose to forgive wholeheartedly, no resentment, no anger, just forgave. You can read more. The story is written in the book Let It Go, where both the father and the young boy were able to actually become very close. And this father...
Yes, I think at the end we can play the video for people to see the character, if we have time.
If we have time, we can play it. So, but what happened? So the father forgave this young teenage boy, but did that stop the fact that this boy still had to go before the judge, still had to go to jail, still had to go through many other things according to the judicial system? Yes. So I just wanted to make that point because it's very important, because some people might have an erroneous idea about that. Forgiveness doesn't mean you need to tell the person that he or she's forgiven or to wait for someone to ask you for their forgiveness. We already discussed the first part of this statement, where with the victim and the perpetrator, you don't have to go to someone and say, hey, I forgive you, because they might, their narrative might be very different than what you have in your perspective. Also, we should never wait for someone to ask us for our forgiveness. We should forgive anyway, or begin the process at the very least. Forgiveness doesn't mean there is nothing further to work out in the relationship or that everything is okay now. This pertains specifically to 2 people that are in an active relationship where there was some sort of trauma or something happened. It just means forgiveness is a process that can take 1 day for some, or it can take 2,000 years. As we read in the books of Emmanuel, it just depends upon the person. Forgiveness doesn't mean you have to continue to include the person in your life. So, for instance, a father and son, or a parent and child, let's put it that way, where the parent sexually abuses a child. Child grows up and forgives the parent. Does that mean that, I forgave my parent. Now I'm an adult, I have children, I want my parent in my life, I'm going to leave my kids with that person. Are you going to do that? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. But that does not and should never impede us from forgiving, because forgiveness is for ourselves, and it's to liberate us from enslavement to that situation.
To make a comment on this, why we should not leave, because we cannot expose a child in a situation that the person is not strong enough to face this. We don't have the parameter, we don't have the measurement to say, okay, this person was abused sexually of children, and we got to know, even though if it is someone related to us, doing this is play with fire, because we don't know. Only God knows, and because of this, it's better either we play caution than expose and create all the problem. But doesn't mean that the feeling that you have against that person will not be worked out. And I think that is the whole goal of this is you need to work in yourself, but also you're not gonna, expose and create a situation that will have that person falls again. Emmanuel says something very interesting. One of his book, I don't remember the book yet. He talked about charity, and he said that in a situation that your person is not yet going along well, So it is a charity for one of the side not to be in presence of that person if the person yet has not capable to face the situation. So it's like a simple example of this is like, for example, if someone drinks alcohol and is alcoholic and do a treatment to stop to drink, and they might stop completely, but always there is that feeling inside. You're not going to invite this person to go to a pub because there is a chance that the person may fall out. Fall out? That's the word. Fall out?
They might
They might,
fall off the wagon again.
relapse.
Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. So it is a situation that we need to analyze each case very carefully because it's very complex subject.
Yes. Forgiveness is not forgetting. So when they talk about it in the gospel according to Spiritism and elsewhere in the codification and elsewhere in the world, biologically, unless you have a neurological degenerative disease such as ALS or Alzheimer's, it's going to alter your brain or some sort of brain disorder or disease that you're going to forget. It's still there in your perispirit, though. But forgiveness is not forgetting. What does that mean? So let me give you a tangible example. So a parent punishes their teenage son or daughter, and because the teenager wants to go out, wants to party, or wants to do a whole lot of things, and then the father has to punish them or reprimand them for either sneaking out or just telling them things that they didn't want to hear. So that teenager in those teenage years are going to harbor that anguish, that anger. But fast forward 20 years, that teenager grows up, matures, hopefully has a family of their own. One day they're going to sit down with their parent, mother or father, and have dinner, lunch with them. And hopefully one day they're going to say, "Dad, you remember back when I was 14 and I was sneaking out and you kept punishing me and I hated you and I said all these terrible things to you. Wasn't that crazy?" So we don't forget. We can always remember. Our memory never goes away. But the way in which we perceive it emotionally is different through years of maturity, understanding, and through the eyes of love. Because now that child has grown up and understands that father, through his love, that is why that father acted that way. And that's, I think, the hope of most parents, that one day my child will grow up and understand why I said, make your bed every day. Keep your room clean. Study hard. Be a good person. Because one day that child will grow up and understand and mature what that means. So it is the emotional memory and our perspective that hopefully will change with time. So forgiveness is not forgetting. And forgiveness isn't something you do for the other person. It is for yourself. It is for ourself. It's not letting someone else off the hook. It's not condoning. It's so that you are freed and you're disconnected. You can disconnect from that hurt, that negative cycle, so you can push ahead. Because that father in the book, Hail Christ, he's not going to have to come back in many incarnations with that soldier unless he chooses to be in a position to act as a missionary. But he's not going to need to come back to repair anything because he already forgave.
And that's so true, too, because when we develop this relationship with someone that, even if we didn't have a relationship, for example, this case of the father and the soldier, so if he decides to behave the other way, to get angry, to get upset with that soldier, what's going to happen? He's going to create a relationship with that soldier. And he can spend he could spend the whole life angry in battle, fight for justice in that lifetime. And what's going to happen when they discarnate? Now they create a situation, so it's like have a handcuff. Handcuff. And so this can move through incarnation after incarnations. And that's why we have our family dynamic, like how many incarnations we have been together. So I think the idea of this presentation is not to tell what you need to do. It's just to create awareness so we can go back home and then we can identify, okay, what is the problem I still have with this family member or with this coworker? And do I want to create this tie, this handcuff with this coworker? Or do I want to tolerate, have intolerance, but disconnect emotionally, resolve our emotional problem? So that's another thing that we forget. Because if we keep thinking about the person that hurt us, what we are doing? We are just connecting with that situation. And sometimes what happens is that the person that hurt us already self-forgave, move on. And we find this in the literature. And sometimes in our mediumistic meeting, when the spirits comes very angry with people that clear we see that already move on in their life. There is still, like, for centuries, searching for revenge or justice. So I think we need to also bring this to our mind. For how long we wanted to be connected emotionally with that person.
Yes.
So that's something that we forget. And we put ourselves in a position to find justice. And this can be trick, because only God can. God's law have already set up in a way that can take care of the situation.
Yes.
And we let, there is some exception in the case of, you mentioned about, if someone is doing something wrong, we need to tell the authority for the benefit of the majority. But emotionally, ourselves, we need to make a decision. Which choice we're going to make? Are we going to be attached to that person for the rest of our life?
Yeah.
So it's just food for thought.
And it's noteworthy when we discuss about forgiveness, which I think we've touched a little bit in some way about, giving mercy, but also this divine justice. Because when we commit an error, or when we do something where we recognize that we did something wrong, when we think about divine justice, or when we think about God, we're imagining a God that is forgiving and understanding and is charitable and is going to understand the wrongs that I did, and I know that I'm forgiven, right? Don't we have at some point in our lives have thought about that? Like, thank God, God is forgiving, and I know that I can move forward with this. However, on the flip side, when someone does something wrong against us, we start to revel in the idea of the God that punishes. I know that in your next life, you're going to get your leg cut off. So we have this duplicity, or this dichotomy, or this ambiguous understanding of God sometimes, depending upon which seat we find ourselves in, if I'm the victim or the perpetrator. So we have to understand that God is very just. He's not a God that punishes. He is a God that forgives, but he forgives everybody, not just us, because it's convenient for me, but because he loves all of his children. And like we shared earlier, in divine justice, they don't just look at one life, they look at multiple lives and take into consideration. But there are, according to Dr. Alberto Almeida, there are 3 factors that we need to take into consideration when we talk about forgiveness. And these 3 factors directly affect how the process of forgiveness is going to happen. 1, the severity of the offense, okay? So the severity of the offense basically is based upon our own interpretation of what we attribute. So for instance, 2 people both can experience the loss of a child, but each experience will be very different for each person. Each person can suffer from, being robbed or any type of offense, sometimes by the same perpetrator, but have very different experiences because we each attribute emotionally different understandings of the situation. So that's 1. 2, our willingness to forgive. The willingness and desire to mobilize greater love will help determine how long this process will take. We have to reach a point where we actually want to move forward and forgive.
Sometimes it's through pain, isn't it? When the pain becomes greater, so then we say, I need to do something with my life. I need to find a therapy. I need to find out why I'm still, have this emotion that it is a disease, feeling.
Hatred is, in a way.
Yeah, it is a disease of the soul, not of the body. So the feeling of upsetness, of angry towards someone that hurt us becomes a disease of the soul. And eventually we will imprint in our physical body. And we already know, we have been studied about this later. So we need to give time for the process, but we know that if we wait for as long as we wait the situation, there is a chance to aggravate. Can be the other way. Sometimes just give time, and time will resolve the situation. You grow, you become mature, so you start to see the situation a different way, change the way the situation happened. You start to understand the situation that the person was. Maybe you learn more about that person. Oh, that person was not happy because that person has also a troubled life. That's why the person did this with us or with you. And now you understand. So the beauty of spiritualism is to bring this, all the components that make us understand why sometimes we need to face situations like this for us to grow.
And when Dr. Almeida mentions in his book that it's the willingness, but also and desire to mobilize greater love, what he's talking about is that mathematical equation we talked about earlier. And sometimes we haven't reached that level yet, where we just haven't developed enough spiritual resources of love within us that we aren't, in that instance, able to forgive immediately, but we do have the opportunity throughout our lives to develop more love. And we're going to talk about that in the next slide. And here as well. And the third factor is our ability to love. So we've all heard that biblical phrase that, love covers a multitude of sin. So this sort of kind of correlates, because we have to remember that, as Dr. Almeida shares, that love is the substrate, the raw material of forgiveness. So again, going back to the same idea, and this is why it's so important for us to know ourselves, to measure how much love I'm capable to give, because that will determine how I'm able to forgive. Because right now, maybe you're not going through anything substantial, maybe in your perspective, that requires you to make a big movement within yourself to forgive. But it may happen. So that's why it's always important to build up a lot of spiritual virtues, to strengthen ourselves, maybe not for our own personal experience, but to impart that to someone else that may need it. And I want to share another kind of quote from the book, that it is related to how much of love we can give. That is why sometimes we need to work on your amount of love in order to give the love required to overcome and forgive. To give forgiveness is to give more love and compassion than what is requested or asked. But again, if we don't have that within our vault, within our hard drive, if we don't have that space within us, we can't proceed forward. But thank God we can develop that. So we wanted to sort of talk about, and this is when we're going to come to a close here very shortly, about the 6 didactic interrelated movements to forgiveness.
So this is movement that we, the person that needs to forgive, we need, the suggestion that needs to do it, isn't it?
Correct.
Okay.
So they're sort of steps in a sense, but we wanted to use the language that Dr. Almeida used exactly, which is these are didactic, interrelated movements that happen within us. So let's go there. First, humility. Why humility? Humility first to acknowledge that either I'm not there yet, I can't forgive yet, I haven't reached that point, I'm not at level 10, I'm more like at a level 4. So we need to acknowledge where we're at. And humility also, because if we find ourselves in the role of being a perpetrator at some point, which we all will or have been, to say, you know what, I made a mistake. and I need to make amends. Because I want to be happy, and I deserve to be happy, and so does everybody else. Step 1. 2, you are the light of the world. This basically means that we have the ability for this love forgiveness movement. We are capable of it. Many people say, I just can't get there. I've heard that many times in and out of the spiritual center. I can never do it. I'll never forgive that person. You will, or you're gonna have to at some point, because that is the law of progress. So it's better that we take the opportunity to practice it, to begin that process of moving forward. 3, charity. Why charity? What is charity? Why is charity a didactic, interrelated movement to forgiveness? So charity is love in action. So in order for us to grow our love, because love is directly correlated to giving forgiveness, it is, when you give forgiveness, it is charity, it is love in action. In the Spirit's book, Question and Answer 886, they tell us that charity can best be described as giving benevolence, indulgence, and forgiveness. We just sorted and called it BIF. But being able to practice this, Dr. Almeida recommends, as well as in the codification as well of Kardec, that through our practice of good virtues, Kardec actually in the Spirit's book, I forget which observation, says that we cannot just rid ourselves of all of our negative tendencies. However, there's a trick. Who doesn't love sort of a trick to sort of make things better in our lives, right? Make things easier. There's no magic bullet, or pill rather. Is that a way for us to counteract our negative side of us is to practice more goodness through charity, through exercising this love for my neighbor, for others, whether that's volunteering at a soup kitchen, whether that is knitting for those that are in need, whether that is giving your time to people that are in need in whatever capacity. But there's no way for us to develop this love and charity without putting into practice. Prayer. We mention it so many times at the SSB. And we always share, it's so undervalued. Prayer for us to gain strength, prayer for those whom we have harmed, prayer for ourselves, prayer to our guardian angel to help us along this pathway. Each didactic step or movement, rather, is very important. Perseverance is so important. If you're not at a level 10 and you're at a level 4 or you're at a level 1 or minus 12, you're going to need perseverance because it's going to be hard. Because most of the time, the perpetrator doesn't want to accept what they've done. You might be triggered throughout your life through many experiences. People that suffer from, who've experienced some sort of violence in any capacity. It's very difficult to overcome that. But through perseverance, you can.
In case there is a case, I think you mentioned this case before about a lady that was raped. It was an opera show that she was raped, and when she went to opera, and the opera says that that might be very traumatic for you. She said, yes, and that day was traumatic. But now, as I move on, he just make that action that day. So I decided, I made a choice that move forward, I would not stay with that emotion. I think you mentioned this story before here that was a lady that went to opera and opera was asking her. And she said, no, you're wrong, opera. What happened that day, I don't bring to my daily life anymore. So she was completely fine. So I think she put this in practice. She just decide, make a choice, and persevere with her decision.
Yes.
And didn't allow that emotion to grow inside of her. There is many videos out there in the YouTube and interviews that bring those example of someone that is very dedicated not to bring those emotions.
Yes.
It is the level of the spirit.
Yes,
We know that.
And we have to put another disclaimer in here that forgiveness truly can be a long process. Not for everybody, but I would say for a lot of people, it is a process, and that's okay. We have to also forgive ourselves, even if we have been victimized. Forgive ourselves, because sometimes it can become frustrating because we want to move on. But we need to forgive ourselves and say, you know what? It is a process. I'm going to get there. I'm going to keep going. I'm going to keep moving. Until one day I reach rebirth. Not in the true rebirth, such as reincarnation, but the metaphorical rebirth, where I can transcend, much like this father whose pregnant wife and 2 children were killed instantly by a drunk driver. In that moment, he could transcend any earthly emotions, and he's able to forgive. And to this day, him and this young man, this is 10 years later, they've written a book together. They travel around telling others and teaching others about forgiveness and the path that leads it to it, so you can, as in their book they published together, so you can let it go and move on. We wanted to share something that's very important that many people do not know, do not consider, do not reflect upon, don't even know exists. And I'm looking for the book, and we're perpetually out of this book. There's a book in the Andrea Louise collection, the collection Life in the Spirit World, that was psychographed by the Brazilian medium, Chico Xavier. There is a book called Liberation. In Portuguese, it's called Libertação. The book is phenomenal. But in that book, Brother Gubbio, along with other mentors, explains to Andrea Louise about this organized lower zone where there exist highly intelligent beings who, one of their mission statements, if you will, is to keep people on earth ignorant and trapped within themselves. So they have organized events. So imagine higher spirituality is so well organized. They have organized caravans and come to the earth to help people. Everything's very disciplined and organized. If you can invert that in a negative sense, that exists in the lower zones. So there are spirits whose sole purpose is to keep you ignorant and me ignorant, to keep us enslaved by hatred, who will whisper in your ear, yeah, you shouldn't forgive them. Look at them. They're still evil. They'll never do anything good with their lives. And that also, as Daniel's mentioned earlier, it makes things more difficult. That's why this process, we always have to take into account the spiritual influence we have. And also those around us. Are we surrounding ourselves with friends and people that are encouraging us to be forgiving, to be charitable, or that are egging you on like, yeah, that person's not worth anything. You should never forgive them. Yeah, man. And they even help plot things. Like, for instance, we had a friend a few years ago that went through a very traumatic situation. And her friend said, you know what? Let's get this person back. We're going to go slash their tires. We're going to go do this, put X-Lax in their coffee when they come into work. This whole thing that they had plotted to do. And everybody's laughing, but it really happens, and this did happen. I heard about it secondhand after the fact, but that doesn't help either. It doesn't help. It just prolongs our own happiness.
Since you mentioned the liberation, that is in this 3rd chapter, because we are reading this book now
At
home. And there is something very interesting, because you talk about the side of the victim, but let's look at the side of the perpetrator. For example, when we cause pain in another. So there is one statement. His mother is trying to help him, and this talk to the mentor
Gubbio. You're referencing Gregorio.
Gregorio, yes.
Who is the leader in the lower realms.
Yes, and what happened is she's telling Gubbio that for the last 50, 70 years, he has questioned, he has some doubt that it is worth it to continue to do evil. Because of that little narrow feeling or thought that he's emitting because he's questioning if it is worth it to continue to do evil. Now the higher spirituality is going to make an investment. So, because now he's in doubt, now he's start to open to become permeable for change. So let us put ourselves in that position, because sometimes we do stuff, we are the perpetrator, and we feel guilt. So how can I reconcile with my action that, is bothering me? So it's just like we start to think about it. Then you're going to open the possibility, so the good spirit is going to make an investment for that to be.
Yes, thank you for pointing that out, Daniel, because this and everything we've talked about pertains to both someone who's been victimized or when we have been the perpetrator at some point. This applies to all of us because we've all played that role in one life to another. Even if you don't remember it, we've all been there. It's in all of our history. Unless you're that rare 1% who hasn't, then I don't know what you're doing here. Maybe you're just taking some notes to write a book later. But if you're here, my friend, we've done some things. So that's okay, and that's totally okay because we need to forgive ourselves because at one point we have to evolve and move on. So this pertains to whether we've been in either role. We can utilize each of these movements within ourselves, and it's important to know that these are the steps to reach this forgiveness. So again, we highly recommend you to read this book. It is not, okay, I'm going to say it again, because some of you are not looking at me right in this moment, and I ask you to look at me. This book is not a coffee book where you sit on a table and you pick it up at your leisure. It is not a book that when you're visiting the lavatory that you should bring it in with you. It is not a book that before you go to bed, I'll do some light reading. It is a book where you sit at your desk, you get a notepad or your iPad or your notebook, and you take notes. It is a textbook. It doesn't look like it. It is a textbook. Much like these are textbooks. They are books to be read, to be studied again and again and again, because depending upon where we find ourselves in this lifetime will depend upon how we understand the knowledge. So we urge you and encourage you to please spend some time reading about forgiveness, learning about it, because ultimately it is the movement of love in action. Thank you all so much for listening.
Okay, so we're going to have 5, maximum 10 minutes of questions and comment. As Kirsten mentioned in the beginning, so our intention was not to give you a magic pill, but also to help all of us here to create this awareness that even if we are not going to the process of forgiveness or doesn't need to work on this feeling, it's highly that one day we're going to encounter someone from past lives that might trigger this feeling on us, and we need to be prepared. So by reading the books, by studying, listening talks, and keeping back and forth about those virtues is the same way that we go to the gym to get strong, because one day we're going to need to move, and then we need to use our muscles. So this is the muscles of the soul. So if you have any question and comment, is now or never.
Yeah, this list, I think, is easier sometimes to get the opposite, the negative part of each one of them. So for instance, humility, the opposite will be arrogance. So if I am an arrogant person towards that situation, either a perpetrator or a victim, I won't be able to move towards forgiveness, because I've been saying, look, I didn't deserve this. The guy says, so you shut up everything. You are the light of the world. It's like you said, you're putting you inside the dark metal locked box and don't want to see any other way for liberation. So it's like this guy, Gregorio, he wants to stay and be the boss. And charity, I think the opposite would be selfishness. Say, look, I don't care about the others. If the others also are suffering, if they have a worse situation than mine, I am the one suffering. I don't care about others. So the selfishness will also prevent and prayer, of course, if you don't put your mind, it's easy to see. Perseverance, those that give up before the time even.
Yep.
So you won't go there because it's a process, so you are defeated even before the process starts.
Yes.
And rebirth, I don't know what is rebirth of a new
It's
me.
metaphorically.
Yeah, new me. Give me a chance to be a different person, no? Yeah. So if I don't give the chance for rebirth, which is the opposite, we won't get there. So sometimes all those things will explain why it's so hard to forgive.
Thank you, Yasko. Absolutely.
Yep.
It's wonderful comments. Thank you. Paula.
The youth also can comment.
Thank you very much. If this was an introduction, I suggest you do this seasonally, and that we keep on peeling the onion into subtopics of what you've just done.
Because you're volunteering yourself to do some of the lectures that are coming up too, right? Yes.
I knew. I just needed a push. I'm happy to help. Could we go back to your drawing of the perpetrator, the victim?
Yes. I think I just passed it. This one?
Yeah. I'm just curious because that's just who I am. All right, I'm going to try to do this quickly. These two have been at it for centuries. They keep reincarnating. They keep changing roles. Let's just let the victim be the one who wakes up. So the victim wakes up, does all the internal processing and the work. It's gone. The perpetrator doesn't. So does the victim's work, it doesn't really matter if it happens or not, I'm just curious, does it register in the perpetrator's perispirit so that the healing of this one bond is obviously over? I could get a little lighthearted here and say, will he or she miss me in the next reincarnation? Because we're not at this same old pattern over and over. And also, because I'm still thinking about the perpetrator, and we're only doing this to learn. We understand we love everyone. That perpetrator's pattern is still going on. It just means they don't attract in this victim.
Yes, and we have a lot of example in the André Luiz books that the victim move on. I think the great example is the book Renunciation, that we see that she was not the victim, but Alcyone, that even it was aware in another planet, she volunteered to come and help the loved one because, to amend. And you read the book and we see that's a tremendous example of, not forgiveness, but also compassion. It is, when we talk about forgiveness, we talk about one virtue. To become a pure spirit, we need to work in forgiveness, indulgence, compassion, patience. So we are just talking about one. So by see the complexity to become a superior spirit or a pure spirit, is not something that we're going to acquire in a couple centuries. It's going to really take a long time.
And I just wanted to comment, Paul, on what you said. The work of each individual is the work of each individual. The victim can do his own work and evolve. The victim cannot make the perpetrator evolve. There is a series of work that this perpetrator must do. So although the victim, in a positive sense, depending upon the case and the relationship, what's going on, like Alcyone, in other books, other cases, action and reaction, the perpetrator might at some point look at his victim and say, wow, they've moved on, I want to move on too, but he might still be stuck in a cycle. So somehow it might affect them, but it does not and will never take away from the personal responsibility that we have to do our own work because that's just the nature of the beast. I shouldn't say beast because that's negative, but it's just the nature of human beings that we have to do our own work, and that we are personally responsible for our happiness or lack thereof, because that's just the way that, go ahead, Leo, that how life works. Thank you, Paula. Did we answer all your questions?
I don't want to be funny, but the question would sound like, what do I have to do with this? Because we have the victim and we have the perpetrator. And those obviously are, and I know you guys were trying to get into the two most direct, individuals connected with it. But there are a lot of cases that we are also connected as a third person, as a fourth person, as collectively in certain situations, not directly involved, but we are involved, right? And a lot of times, certain situations arise where we're not the victim, we're not the perpetrator, but we're still involved. We're still in the family setting, we're still in society, and all those things. In this study that you have done, this one and obviously previously, just any comments that you can bring as well, because ultimately we're together. I know that, but what are the approaches, even as a psychologist, someone who is helping this situation, right? Because sometimes we think, oh, no, I'm just here to go ahead and make my paycheck. But ultimately, we also have a connection with the case and so on and so forth. So any thoughts, any ideas in that sense?
So nothing is by chance. And let me restate your question to make sure I'm understanding it. Your question is, what if I am this life, neither the perpetrator nor the victim, but I am in this family dynamic where I'm witnessing either or both, whether it's in a work setting or a home setting? What is my responsibility? My responsibility in the Spirit's book, I believe it's in the, when they talk about either the law of progress, it's in part 3, where they say that our responsibility is always to do all the good we can do that is within my power to do. And only I, as an individual, can determine what that means. So wherever I find myself, I am to do all the goodness I can do that is within my power to do. So if I have the power to be a peacemaker, to offer words of wisdom, you do that. If I am in a family setting where I'm seeing perpetrator and victim go back and forth, it is I'm 99.9% sure that that is not the first setting we find ourselves in. Even in our work situation, we come back in the same exact circles to repair, to make amends. We can find those cases in the books where we come back in the same social setting of the same people that we come back to repair things with. Before you do, Yasko, I just want to say something, because until we go through a really bad situation where we need to either exercise forgiveness, whether for ourselves or to someone else or to others, we may not realize how important this is. And again, that's sort of the nature of human beings, that we don't realize how important having our spiritual life is until we're suffering. There are two powers in this life, in the world, in the universe, that makes us move. In chapter 7 in the book, Action and Reaction, they talk about this. The power of God is the strongest power. Who can guess what the second most strongest power? Sarah saying love? No, Leo, you can't answer because we've done a series. Any guess? Pain.
Pain.
Why? Because pain will make you move. It will force you to make a movement. So either we can, and in Portuguese there's a saying I heard growing up a lot, either by love or by pain, you choose. In the Spirit's book, they say we can be happier. It takes very little effort for us to progress. Very little, the Spirits tell us. We just need to make a little bit of a movement. We tend to be a little bit lazy in a spiritual sense sometimes. So we need to get to know ourselves. I just wanted to say that because I feel like this might not be relevant to you right now. It's relevant to someone that may not be relevant to everybody in this room. But
Or
this,
online.
or online. But this can be directly correlated to suicide. Because if I can't forgive myself, or if I can't forgive somebody else, and I can't move on, I'm going to end my life. That's why this is also so important. To never give up. Go ahead, Yasko.
Last comment, and then we're going to move to our passes.
Yes.
About the question Leo put up, the third person, the third party. We all connected. We all share stories from the past lives. And of course, we have obsessors that may be common to our family group, our group. So if one of these two moved away already, move up, the obsessor will get this third person that is not vigilant, that still is not in that level that you say is there with positive action. It may be still in a negative side, spectrum. So the obsessor will get that person in order to keep the circle, vicious circle going on.
Yep.
The perpetrator to keep on. So be aware that we may be caught up.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Yasko.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. So, as we see, I didn't see anyone sleeping here. So, what means that this topic is very important. It's very important. So, there is different levels of victim and perpetrator. Sometimes when we think about this, we think about someone that commit crime or something that was very traumatic. But in our day-to-day life, we have examples, small examples with a neighborhood, our coworker. So all of these things that we brought here, this is third, also can be applied for the little things that is difficult for us to move on. You know, and only us know what is difficult inside of us. But the good news that we are together, we have these beautiful teachings that has been helped so many people across this planet, and we are trying to spread and to bring this teaching to, you know, those that is thirsty for knowledge, for to find out why, you know, things is the way it is. But we always can change. So right now we're gonna move on to our passes. So can you do just a little visualization so we can set up our environment to receive the passes?
Yes. So we ask everyone to take everything off their yes, please, lights. Thank you, Aloisa.